Well, we thank you for joining us here today. You know, as many of you know, and way more people than I personally ever imagined know, last December, I decided to share a very personal story and a very painful story publicly for the very first time because the legislature was getting ready to pass what they call the Abortion Insurance Opt-out Act, which, as you all know, was a veto-proof act to sidestep a gubernatorial veto. The governor had twice vetoed legislation before. Governor Snyder had once, and Governor Engler had before him. And, it was a very difficult day, but we thought as we watched the debate proceed, and I use the word debate lightly, there was no debate. There was no public hearing. There was no opportunity for medical providers to speak, for any woman to have her voice heard, for any woman who had been through a procedure that this new bill covered to have an opportunity to speak. And so as I went to the microphone, I thought it was necessary to tell a story, to put a voice and a face to the women that were going to be impacted by this new law, the law that I call rape insurance. It's a law that disregards the variety of circumstances that we face in our lives, circumstances we will hear a little bit about more today. This bill, this new law, hurts all women, not just women who are victims of incest or rape, or who experience the gut-wrenching effect of a miscarriage, but every single woman who has to make the decision, and man who has to make the decision about whether or not to pre-purchase abortion rider insurance for the women who are covered by their insurance policy, including their daughters. So as part of my job as a legislator, I've had the opportunity to go all over the state and speak with people. And I'll tell you, the morning after I gave my floor speech, I was really pretty depressed. You know, I got up the next morning and I hadn't changed a single vote on the floor that night. And I wondered if it was all worth it. But by the time I got to my office, and every day since, I have heard from women who are speaking out about this law, who are speaking out about violence, who are speaking out on all sorts of issues, because this issue wasn't about me. It's about all the women in our state. Michigan women are scared and confused, and they're absolutely appalled by what this law in particular does, and what it means, and how it came about. Right to Life, as you recall, pushed for this law legislatively 2 times before, with 2 different governors vetoing it. And instead of giving up, Right to Life in Michigan found a way to intentionally circumvent the voters and the governor's veto pen. They found an obscure loophole in the Michigan Constitution whereby collecting the signatures of a mere 300,000 people in our state, they were able to get this into law through a simple majority of both chambers. Right to Life then used money and influence to lean on the Republican-led legislature to enact the proposal instead of letting it go to the statewide ballot this fall. As it stands now, 3% of our citizens dictated the law for 100% of the women in our state. The abortion insurance opt-out is an awful law, one of the most misogynistic proposals I've seen in my time here at the Capitol. And the devious way that it was enacted was also insulting. All Michigan voters, and especially women, were disenfranchised and silenced by the way that this law came about. And all Michigan women are insulted by what this law entails. From every young girl to every grandmother who has asked me about this law, I assured them that we are going to fight back, and that starts today. And that's why we've introduced this legislation to repeal this ridiculous law. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague in the House, Representative Sarah Roberts.
Thank you, Leader Whitmer. Across the state, there are many women who are faced with difficult medical decisions in their lifetime. And women want nothing more than to have a healthy pregnancy and give birth to a healthy baby, but may have suffered a miscarriage instead of a joyful birth. Women who survived rape only to realize weeks later that their ordeal wasn't over and that they had become pregnant. Women betrayed by family members they trusted, who then had to make a difficult decision as they felt vulnerable and alone. These women are our mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives. They deserve the absolute best health care possible, not hurdles that come between them and the critical care they need. Instead, we now have a law that is extreme and reckless, putting the health and lives of women in danger. Before it passed, doctors warned that it was poorly worded, that it would prohibit regular health insurance from covering routine yet critical care with miscarriages. Because of this law, even women who want to have a healthy and happy child would have to buy this additional women's health care rider just in case their pregnancy ended in a miscarriage or a fetal malformation that could end the life of the fetus before full term or just after birth. If they don't have this extra rider, as we know, they would have a choice. Either pay for the care out of pocket, which could cost thousands of dollars, up to $10,000, or not get the health care that they need, putting their health and their future fertility in jeopardy. Our law should protect all of our citizens. Instead, this law punishes women when they are at their most vulnerable. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Timothy Johnson, and I'm an obstetrician gynecologist and a high-risk obstetrician. I am professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Michigan and also professor of women's studies. And I'm here to talk about some of the challenges that providers have already seen since the passage of this law. And I want to talk about two specific kinds of cases. One are the miscarriage cases, and the other are the fetal malformation cases. And I can tell you that since this law has been passed on a weekly basis, we have seen patients referred to the University of Michigan Hospital in both of these situations. This law, as we predicted, because of its vagueness and because of the chilling effect that it has on physicians who don't really understand it, leads to a lot of uncertainty in the doctor-patient relationship. And I think as a practicing physician, when physicians and patients are in difficult situations, making difficult decisions, the last thing we want is to worry about who's going to pay for a necessary procedure, or somebody be confused about how much are people going to pay and what does it exactly mean. And so this law really comes in a space between the doctor and patient relationship. And let me give you two kinds of examples. We've had patients recently who have had what we call incomplete miscarriages. In medical language, abortion means any type of loss of pregnancy. So a patient comes in, let's say we've had a patient, and I don't want to be too specific, but let me give you a kind of a scenario. Patient has ruptured membranes at 11 weeks, and in that situation, the pregnancy is simply not viable. It's not going to be able to continue. It's not going to be able to survive in that situation, but the baby still has a heartbeat. Any medical decision maker would say that that pregnancy needs to be terminated for the health of the mother, for the life of the mother, and the chances of having a child in that terrible situation, that sad situation, is not feasible. Doctors don't know what to do in that kind of a situation, especially in hospitals where healthcare costs are high and where doctors aren't in control. And so those patients get referred from one place to another in a situation where their medical care should really have been taken care of immediately. Even more sadly for me, as a high-risk obstetrician, we see on a regular basis now patients who have complex congenital malformations, genetic abnormalities that are identified. So it's a scenario, a married couple who both are carriers of a genetic abnormality, and they have prenatal screening, and they've had 2 normal children. Third time, fourth time, they have genetic screening, and this time the baby has a lethal abnormality that's going to lead to its death either in utero or in the first weeks of life, a really horrific death with no possibility of any kind of survival. Those patients, unfortunately, now find themselves in situations where, unbeknownst to them, their health care coverage no longer provides coverage for that kind of termination of that pregnancy. Clearly, it's a pregnancy that's not going to go anywhere. Clearly, it's a pregnancy that's not going to be viable. Clearly, the societal costs of carrying it forward, the risks to the mother of carrying it forward are very, very high. But her insurance doesn't cover it. So her options are to go to Planned Parenthood or to go to a hospital where the costs of terminating that pregnancy could be $8,000 or $9,000. So I think this law has a lot of perverse outcomes, perverse consequences that are causing patients to suffer, causing women to suffer, causing families to suffer, causing marriages to suffer. And I don't think that's what the people of the state of Michigan wanted when they passed this legislation. So I can tell you that I, in my practice, have seen patients suffering as a result of this law, and I'm very supportive of the work of Senator Whitmer and Representative Roberts to change the situation here in the state of Michigan. And I'm turning it back over to Representative Roberts.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, and he will certainly be around to answer any questions that the press may have. So there's something that's even worse, not even worse, I'm sorry, there is something additionally terrible that is happening with this law. So while this law mandates that women get extra insurance, and while I know I was having conversations with my Republican colleagues about this law, they simply said they just have to buy a rider. They just have to buy, separate insurance. Well, there are 42 health insurance companies in Michigan, and currently 7 are offering the rider. So to say that women just simply need to buy this rider so that they're covered in case they're raped or in case there's a medical situation that needs to result in the termination of the pregnancy, there are many cases for women where they can't even buy the insurance. And of those, none of them make this extra insurance available to women who buy insurance on their own or through the exchange. To get the Women's Health Rider, you have to work for an employer who offers health care coverage through one of these 7 companies and who choose to include it as part of their benefit package. So even if a woman decides she needs or feels it's necessary to have the extra insurance that is mandated by this law, there's a very good chance that they're not even going to be able to get it. Senator Whitmer spoke earlier, and I'm just going to briefly recap a few of the things that she said. That the only reason this law is on the books is because of a special interest group that holds a lot of influence over the Republican Party, and they wanted it. They gathered signatures for a citizen initiative getting approximately 3% of the population to sign it. And they faced a choice. They could do the bidding of this special interest or let it go before the people in the form of a ballot initiative and let the people decide. But they didn't want it on the ballot because they knew that the majority of Michiganders opposed this initiative and that they would vote in opposition to it. So they caved in. This is not democracy. This is not the Michigan that I know, and this is not the Michigan that women want to live in. And again, when this law was passed in December, Senator Whitmer and I spoke with hundreds of women from across the state who were appalled by this law and how it came to be. I had phone calls, I had emails, women asking, what can I do? What can I do to get involved, to change this, to stop this? So we promised that we would fight to repeal it, and that's why we're here today. And now I'd like to hand it over to Jennifer from Ann Arbor, who is very brave to come in and share her story and her perspective with us today.
Thank you, Representative Roberts, and I want to say thanks for providing me the opportunity to share my story, because I think it is important to remember the personal lives that are affected when we're talking about policy. So my name is Jennifer Lane, and a few years ago my husband and I had planned our second pregnancy. I had a 5-year-old daughter, and we had showed her the ultrasound pictures at the 12-week ultrasound, and she called him Blobby because looked like a blob, those ultrasound pictures early on. And so we brought her to our standard ultrasound when we were to learn about the sex of the baby, because she was excited and wanted to know whether she was going to have a brother or sister. So that was a long appointment. We didn't know why it was so long, but unbeknownst to us that it was really diagnostic, because the technician could see that the fetus was missing an important part of his brain, is how we described it to my daughter when we later learned that he had a fetal abnormality, a rare brain malformation. And so I got the call that night, and we learned about the condition, and the subsequent weeks were spent, a couple of weeks, really that next week was consulting with specialists and doctors and geneticists and family and dear friends to try to make the best decision that we could when we learned that it would be very unlikely that he would make it to term. So after many tears, and we didn't want to wait much longer because I was visibly pregnant, and we were, you know, it was a wrenching decision to have to make, but we did decide to terminate the pregnancy. And it was covered under insurance, and so it never entered my mind that it wouldn't be covered under insurance. We checked into the hospital, and the safest way to end a pregnancy at that stage, as I understand it, was for me to go through labor. And so said, let my body take the cues of the medication. So I was in the hospital for 3 days while I delivered Robert, whom we eventually named Robert, is the long formal version of Blobby. My daughter gave him the middle name of Brother. So we were able to be in the hospital and grieve while we held him, and the support staff, the medical staff, were incredibly supportive. And it was really the most traumatic and awful time of our lives. And what I imagine sometimes, since this legislation has passed, is what that decision would have been like if we would have had to also face the decision about this burdensome cost. We're teachers, we don't have a lot of disposable income, and that thousands of dollars on top of our already heavy load of grieving emotionally would have been, I don't know. I don't know what that would have felt like. And I'm so thankful that we didn't have that additional cost. It was already, you know, a really, really awful time for us to begin with. So I want to add that if this law was in place at the time when we had to make that decision and when we had to lose Robert, I doubt that I would have bought a rider on an insurance policy if I'd even had the option to. My realm at that time was planning pregnancies and wanting to have a healthy pregnancy, and I had a child already who was healthy and lovely, and I didn't foresee any possibility that I wouldn't want to have a pregnancy. So I would likely have been in the situation of having to shoulder that cost and weigh that in deciding what was safest for us, what our doctors had suggested and supported, along with what we felt. And part of the reason, too, why we made that decision that was so difficult for us to make was that I was pregnant. I was visibly pregnant, and to have to wait until I lost the pregnancy naturally would mean that I would presumably, possibly go through a couple more months of pregnancy, getting bigger, having people strike up conversation with me, as people do when someone's pregnant, hold the door for me, smile at me, and be out in the world when I knew that that pregnancy wasn't going to be able to be. So I think that would have been a pretty awful scenario, and I'm really thankful that I didn't have to go through that. Subsequently, the next year I was able to get pregnant again. I have a beautiful, healthy second daughter, and I'm very thankful that my medical procedure, that the birth and loss of Robert was smooth, and that I came out of it fine, and I could have a healthy child after that, and I'm grateful for that as well. I want to thank you for listening, and I urge the Michigan Legislature to consider my story and so many others that are like mine, and to vote to repeal this law. And I just want to add that after that experience, I had friends who came out of the woodwork who put me in touch with other friends. And I can't tell you how many women I talked to who had been through similar losses. And because this is often a private thing, because there's stigma, because it's so difficult in our culture to talk about this, I was amazed by the amount of support that I got from people, family members who I know have very conflicted feelings about abortion, said to me, I can understand why you would make this decision. I would probably make a similar decision in a similar situation. It was very heartening to me to feel that kind of support, and also amazing to see how many people had been through similar situations. So it really is impactful on many, many lives. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing that story. And before we close, I have a question for Dr. Johnson that I think is important in this discussion and what we're presenting with you today. And that is to the point of the ambiguity in the language of the law, because I have heard a representative from Right to Life on the radio say, well, this covers miscarriages. But it's our understanding that it doesn't cover all miscarriages, that there's ambiguity in the law, and if a doctor is to seek reimbursement for a procedure to then find that that procedure is not covered under the law, they can be fined up to $10,000. So to answer that or add any additional comments.
No, I think that's right. I think that when this law was being considered, there was a lot of concern about just exactly what it meant. And there's language in there that says miscarriage is not part of the law, but it's not exactly clear what that means. I mean, there are different types of miscarriages. Does it mean when there's been loss of fetal heart motion and so on and so forth? And because doctors are very much afraid. I mean, it has a chilling effect on how people practice and what people want to do. They don't want to follow the law. They don't want to be guilty of, this is actually guilty of a felony. It could affect their medical license. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And these are very difficult situations. Just listening to Jennifer, you can imagine the agony that she and her doctors and her healthcare team were involved with. And to add this kind of complexity into that kind of decision making is really difficult for physicians. This is all about patients. This is all about women, really. But unfortunately, what happens is that doctors start thinking about something else instead of thinking about the real health care when they start worrying about the money. And I think that's where we start getting into trouble.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Senator Whitmer did have to leave for another obligation that she had. But again, we are just simply calling on the legislature to repeal this really dangerous and ill-thought-out law. It is very clear to me that those who put forth this initiative and the pressure that they put on legislators didn't do their homework in terms of the language, what it would mean, what some of these outcomes could be, or the implications.